Hi, and welcome. This is our first live Let's Talk About Hanford event. I'm Ginger Wireman with the Washington State Department of Ecology's Nuclear Waste Program in Richland. We are coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla people. And we're gonna get a nice overview of Hanford history tonight from our guest speaker, Robert Franklin, who teaches at WSU and CBC. And Robert, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, hi, thank you, Ginger. My name is Robert Franklin. I have been doing Hanford history for about 5 years now. I started with the Hanford History Project in 2016 as the archivist and oral historian there, and that's a project at WSU Tri-Cities that is funded by the Department of Energy to collect and preserve, protect, and promote the Department of Energy's Hanford collection, which is an archive and artifact collection taken from the site. In addition to running an oral history program there that focuses on capturing the experiences of Hanford workers and people in the communities around Hanford. Since then, we've also started a book series with WSU Press, where we published 3 books, and I'm also a lecturer in the history department at Washington State University.
Cool.
And president of the Reactor Museum Association, and a docent at the Manhattan Project National Historical Park for the pre-Manhattan tour and the B-Reactor tour.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, well, and also with us tonight is my colleague, Ryan Miller. Ryan can introduce himself and also go over a little bit of housekeeping.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Ryan Miller. I've been a media coordinator with the Nuclear Waste Program for about 2 years now, and before that I was a reporter for a couple of years down in Oklahoma. So before we begin the conversation, like Ginger said, I'm just going to share some housekeeping items and how tonight's going to work. So tonight's conversation is going to focus on early Hanford history, and specifically that's going to be the history of the site before the government arrived through the end of World War II. So we really encourage everybody that's listening today to join the conversation, comment, and provide any feedback and thoughts you have about Robert's presentation in the live chat, and then also ask us any questions you have, and we'll get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A session after Robert's presentation. So here in a minute, I'm going to kick it off to Robert to present for us, and then after that, we're going to do a live Q&A. And I do want to remind everybody that this topic is specifically on early Hanford history, so I'd like to encourage you to focus your questions on early Hanford history. If you have any questions that are on a different topic, we encourage you to kind of hold those questions until we have a future conversation where we'll have an appropriate subject matter expert. So again, I'm only going to be taking questions that are kind of relevant to ask Robert, since he's our Hanford history expert. So you can feel free to email us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov any questions you have on other topics, or you can just hold them until we have a future live event that's on a related topic. So on that note, I'll hand it off to Robert, and let's learn about some Hanford history.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here tonight and to be presenting about Hanford history and sharing some of the material from our collections. If I get to the next slide.
Oh no.
Next slide. Okay, great. Okay. Oh wow, it's back. It's mirrored. Okay. The map slide, please. Okay. So here are 2 different maps of the Hanford site. The one on the left is this more modern map showing the current boundaries of the site itself. They're kind of in beige, surrounded by the green area, which is part of the Hanford Reach National Monument, the arid lands, Ebner Fitzhart Arid Lands Ecology Reserve. But initially, in that kind of checkered boundary, this was all part of the Hanford site that was taken by the government in late 1942, early 1943. Taken from the indigenous peoples that called it that call it their home, as well as the Euro-American settlers that were there. The area in green is no longer part of the site specifically. That was taken as kind of borderland area for security reasons and also for safety reasons. That's the surrounding hills of the site to hopefully the idea was you'd want the land in the valley up to the hill to kind of contain any sort of, the planning for any sort of mishap, which luckily a mishap of that magnitude in terms of something going, exploding Never did happen. Over on the right, we have this is a 1938, what's called a Metzger map. It's an early road atlas map. And I really like this map because it just shows Benton County here, and it shows kind of the horn of the Columbia River, and the communities up near the horn of White Bluffs and Hanford. Of course, the small farming communities that kind of give this area some of their names. The White Bluffs, of course, are White Bluffs named after the White Bluffs of the Columbia. The town of Hanford, of course, which gives the Hanford site its name, as well as the very small farming village of Richland and its environment. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, let me take a moment here. As I mentioned before, this area of the Priest Rapids Valley has been home for thousands and thousands of years of our indigenous peoples. Some of the tribes mentioned earlier, such as the Cayuse, the Walla, the Umatilla, call their homelands here, as well as other tribes like the Nez Perce and the Yakama are connected to this land as well. And the Wanapum tribe, not federally recognized, but has a deep connection to this land. Wanapum meaning people of the river, a proximate translation. And this area, the Columbia, which features many significant sites, including Lalick, Rattlesnake Mountain, Nookshy or Gable Mountain, as well as Coyote Rapids, which had been the site of a very important longhouse associated with the Wanapum prophet Smohala. And also this area, just for thousands of years, obviously had been a site of trading, of resource gathering, very important for salmon, and archaeological sites abound on the Hanford site. And so, evidence of a very rich history, one that was cut short in 1942 when the government took this land and pretty quickly denied access for many, many decades for its indigenous inhabitants. This photo here is a shot of tule huts on the Columbia River, dating from before World War II, I think right around the 1930s. Okay, next slide, please. Euro-American settlement started in the area, continuous Euro-American settlement started at around 1860 in the area of White Bluffs. White Bluffs was established as a ferry crossing area, and it's kind of naturally a good crossing because of two different back currents that occur on the Columbia River here. This area had long been a crossing point for indigenous peoples as well. A ferry was put in here. This is an early horse-drawn ferry operated by Archie Borden, approximately 1906. In this picture, a ferry had been put in here first to ferry people traveling up to gold mines in northern Idaho and northeastern Washington, and really wasn't agricultural settlement in this area until the turn of the 20th century and the arrival of irrigation companies and irrigation canals. So next slide, please. So a variety of methods were used to try to attract farmers to this irrigated area of the Hanford site. There were several, I think 4 or 5 different private irrigation firms in just about 4 decades alone, starting in 1904 with the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company. Private irrigation has a kind of a storied, it's a story of failure largely in the arid West, reason why the government created the Bureau of Reclamation and after the New Lands Reclamation Act in 1902, because private irrigators generally couldn't supply reliable water at cheap rates. And we still struggle. I think there's still plenty of complaints about irrigation districts today. However, certainly there were many more when it was a privatized system. Irrigation works are expensive. They lose a lot of water, and they depend on the ability of the farmer to pay depends on the ability to get water. Several different types of crops were attempted to be grown here. Tree fruits, apples, cherries, various stone fruits, but also alfalfa, peppermint, asparagus. Most of these for sale in markets in Portland and Seattle and elsewhere. And a real lifeblood of this area of early settlement was a branch line of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad that was put through down to Hanford in 1912, 1913. Before that time, it had been mostly steamboat travel, which was very slow and expensive. Next slide, please. So the Hanford site had approximately 1,200 residents, 1,250 residents, Euro-American residents, sorry, that were evacuated in 1943. And here you can see one of what's called a declaration of taking. This was an official government assessment of a particular individual's land. After the executive order in late 1942, which established Hanford as part of the Manhattan Project, the government in early 43 sent out land agents, contracted with land agents to spread out among these communities of Hanford, White Bluffs, Richland, and some of the smaller whistle stops to evaluate land and give offers to settlers. And so these settlements were sometimes considered to be fair, sometimes considered to be not fair. Many of them, some of them were litigated after World War II because the initial settlement was deemed to be insufficient. These lawsuits were put on hold during World War II because General Groves and Colonel Franklin Matthias, the head of the Manhattan Project at Washington, or in Hanford, didn't want there to be litigate, didn't want stories, newspaper coverage of any government litigation of the area to avoid newspaper coverage. So why Hanford? Well, Franklin Matthias flies over the Priest Rapids Valley on December 22nd of 1942. He's been charged by General Groves of finding a site for this plutonium works. At this time, Oak Ridge is already well under construction. Los Alamos has been chosen as kind of the brain trust headquarters to build the bomb. But the plutonium process is going to be one of the two processes to build a bomb, and they want to locate it away from Oak Ridge. And they decide that they want to locate it somewhere in the west, and they know they're going to need a lot of water for it. So Hanford's actually one of the last sites that Matthias checks out. And as he flies over the Priest Rapids Valley, he kind of sees everything that he thinks will make it a perfect site. There's an availability of surplus electricity from the Grand Coulee and the Bonneville dams. It's remote. There's only about 1,250 settlers in the area that'll be displaced in this 586 square miles that's going to be taken. There's rail connections at Pasco. Pasco will, during World War II, become one of the largest railroad shipping points west of the Mississippi. Ability to bring in a lot of freight. And a few other features. It's surrounded by mountains on most sides, or hills, making it secure. And the soil is largely sandy and dry, meaning that it'll be easy to build these large concrete structures, these monoliths in some way for the atomic age, the reactors and the processing canyons and so forth. After a little reluctance, General Groves tasks the DuPont company to take the contract to build and run the facility for the duration of the war. Okay, next slide, please. So the story of plutonium production in Hanford, in many ways, we're going to follow the path of fuel as it goes from its creation into the creation of plutonium, the extraction of plutonium. So fuel starts in the 300 area. That's the area just north of Richland, which has mostly been most of the structures have been removed at this point, with a few left that are pretty contaminated. But the fuel was made here. The uranium fuel was canned into aluminum slugs, and these slugs would be transported and loaded into the reactor. In addition, the 300 area later became home to a lot of the research and development labs, a couple test reactors during the Cold War. But its primary mission is the area where the fuel is made. And so the fuel is going to be created here, and this is a real trial and error process to get reliable aluminum coated uranium fuel pellets or fuel slugs that won't leak. So this fuel is loaded by hand into trucks and transported to, next slide, please. The 100 area, the reactor areas. Initially, DuPont builds 3 reactors, the B, the D, and the F reactor. One of the questions I get sometimes is, where's the A reactor? Well, DuPont had cited different areas along the river, and all these reactors are along the river. But the A area was deemed to be a little too close to the Midway substation and the state highway. And they wanted a bit of space in between each reactor, because these were the world's first nuclear or full-scale production reactors, and so they wanted to give them space in case it didn't work out like they thought it would or hoped it would. The reactors are what's known as single-pass graphite moderated reactors, meaning that graphite acts as the moderator to slow down neutrons and form the chain reaction, self-sustaining chain reaction, which converts a very small amount of uranium-238 into plutonium 239, 240. And single pass means that they're water cooled, but the water takes a kind of a single pass through the reactor. Goes in at just above freezing, comes out at almost boiling, and then is, after a cooling period, is discharged back into the river. The fuel would stay in the reactors for an average of 1 to 3 months, just depending on its location in the reactor, and then get cooled in a pool of water. And then it would be loaded remotely into lead-lined cask cars on a train and trained up to, next slide, please. The 200 area. These were these long concrete canyons in the middle of the desert. These were often called Queen Marys because they were roughly the size of an ocean liner, about 800 feet long, several stories, but 60 feet tall. And their concrete walls went from 6 feet to 3 feet thick from the bottom to the top. So really heavy, shielded. And this is really where the fuel is going to be stripped out and the plutonium extracted. And this is where the vast majority of the waste is generated. This is where a lot of the real danger lies, is here in the 200 area. 200 area is not near the river. It's up above the river on the Hanford Plateau, several hundred feet above the groundwater. And it was sited away from the reactors as well for safety concerns. Because if they didn't want to, again, these are the world's first plutonium separation facilities. And so a lot of space was needed. This is where the lion's share of the waste is. This is where the tank farms are, those 177 tanks, of which during the Manhattan Project, it is the single shelled tanks that were built to store the massive amounts of waste. Less than a fraction of a percent of plutonium was contained in each uranium fuel rod. And so it's a very long series of process chemistry, batch chemistry, to extract that plutonium. That plutonium was then taken to a finishing area where early on it was turned into a kind of a nitrate solution, a liquid solution, that was then sent off to Los Alamos to be developed into the atomic bombs. Next slide, please. Here's a shot of some of the early World War II era single-shelled waste tanks, about 45 feet tall. Each one of them, I forget exactly the gallons that they hold, but these are massive, massive structures that were designed to hold some pretty intensely, not only radioactive but also caustic waste. There's a lot of pretty nasty chemicals that go into, say, stripping uranium away, and a lot of variety of different processes to pull out different radioactive isotopes, needed or not needed, to isolate the plutonium. Next slide, please. Hanford also constructed a laboratory and biology department near the F reactor. Early on, studies were done analyzing the effect that Hanford might have on fish in the Columbia River. Obviously, some concern existed about the impacts to the commercial fish industry. Of course, and as well, here is where a lot of the kind of the health physics department was located, concerned about protecting workers. Hanford's concerns on the environment certainly evolved over time. There was the early concern of the fish is notable, but lacking, of course, was early concern of Hanford's effect on the general population, the effects of stat gases from these plutonium production facilities that we just saw, the 200 area, as well as how it might affect the local flora and fauna, both of the site itself, the river, and of course, people downwind of Hanford. Those were not exactly focuses of early Hanford studies. As well as the labs later on in the early Cold War went on to study the effects of plutonium inhalation and skin contamination using animals. Beagle dogs and pigs were the two main species used to study skin contamination, and a whole book could be written just about why those animals were chosen and what they did and how they did it. Next slide, please. So this is an aerial of the Hanford construction camp, what became a town of about 46,000 people that built the Hanford site during World War II. The first construction workers arrived kind of in the late spring of 1945. By late 1943. By late 1944, the town was at its kind of maximum occupancy of about 45,600 people, which was the fourth largest city in Washington State. The largest general delivery post office in the United States. And by early February 1945, March 1945, it was a ghost town. There were goats roamed the streets, and it was empty because the site had been built and its construction workers moved on. This Hanford construction camp grew up around the old town of Hanford, which had a population of 400, and hence giving the Hanford construction camp and the Hanford site its name. The Hanford camp was DuPont recruited about 120,000 people in total to come to the Hanford site, about of which 45,000 were there at its peak. A lot of turnover at Hanford, the harsh condition, the secrecy of the work environments meant that Hanford had a high rate of turnover. To combat this, Hanford tried to lure in people with good pay, with good food. The camps and the work sites were segregated by gender, and they were also segregated by race. Because of federal contracting law, DuPont had to employ somewhere between 10 to 15% of its workforce as African Americans, thereby contributing to one of the largest mass migration in American history, the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North and West, a law processed roughly from the World War I to the end of the 1960s. Really reaching a high point in World War II. And all told, Hanford recruited somewhere about 10,000 African-American residents to the Pacific Northwest, some of whom stayed and took up residency in the east side of Pasco, itself an earlier kind of railroad area of town, and one that became known as a slum-like area because of the neglect of the city of Pasco and the longstanding anti-Black racism of the Pacific Northwest. And indeed, African Americans faced overt discrimination both at the Hanford site in terms of jobs they could take, racism from workers, as well as discrimination in the local community here that persisted for several decades overtly. And as this last summer has shown, can persist in many forms still today. The next slide, please. So the temporary workers lived in the construction camp, but the farming village of Richland here on the left, which had a population of about 240 in 1942, was transformed into a bedroom community for permanent workers of the Hanford site. And to kind of riff off Kate Brown's book, it became a utopia that produced plutonium, or a plutopia. Next slide, please. DuPont and the Army constructed a suburban community of alphabet houses, named because each house, each plan was given a alphabet designation. Many were duplexes, like A's and B's. More prized were single-family homes like H's and F's and Q's and R's and U's. And these were reserved for mid to upper level management and technically skilled individuals. A housing shortage at Hanford remained until the early 1950s, and many new single arrivals found themselves living in dormitories until they got settled down. Next slide, please. Here's kind of a shot of that early domestic white, literal white picket fence bliss. Notable about Hanford and Richland and its alphabet homes is that this really signaled the coming of post-war suburbia, but it preceded it. The first kind of suburban Leave It to Beaver type developments that we think of when we think of that is the Levitt towns, which were built in 1947-48. Richland is in many ways years ahead of that. These kind of planned communities orientated around the automobile with planned shopping districts and things and of that nature. In so many ways, Richland was a groundbreaker for that uniform suburban culture that we sometimes love to hate. Next slide, please. To deal with the housing shortage, chronic housing shortage, the Army forced DuPont to take hundreds and hundreds of prefabricated units that were actually designed by the Tennessee Valley Authority, a New Deal agency, as public housing for farmers on relief during the New Deal. These prefabs as they're known, were of poorer quality, generally plywood construction, all electric utilities, and they were much smaller and were generally given to working class or younger families. And in the early years, they even had flat canvas roofs, which during particularly heavy windstorms were known to actually lift off and blow away, which would be a really bad thing to wake up to. And those storms, I should say, the storms and the dust were so bad during the early years, and even people up into the 50s, 60s remember they were known as termination winds. These dust storms would roll in, and when they would, the kind of apocryphal joke is that the line to leave Hanford, the terminating line, people getting their last paychecks, was as long as the line of fresh people coming in to replace them. Next slide, please. I wanted to end this talk of domestic bliss with a slide showing Johnny Tamanawash on the left and Johnny Buck Pakayatut, two important Wanapum leaders, in front of a Hanford gate in the late 1940s, the Yakama barricade. Once production began after the construction period, the Hanford site was effectively off limits for all of its former residents, including the Wanapum and other tribal groups mentioned that had strong cultural, religious, and personal ties to the land. And I love this photo for it signifies that off limitsness and that physical separation, maybe better than words can. Okay, last slide, please. So the dropping of the atom bombs lifted the veil of absolute secrecy over the Hanford site and was, for many, dispelled the rumors or was confirmation on what they had labored over. Of course, much about the site would remain secret or classified, or both, over the decades, but in many ways, the genie, for good or bad, was out of the bottle. And this, of course, is well, I'll just say the Manhattan Project technically continues through 1946. In January of 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission takes over. The project is transferred out of military hands to civilian hands, and that's really the official end date for the project, and that's kind of where we'll end the history here, the questions. And so the last slide, please. This is, my photos, where they come from. Most stuff from our collections, except for a couple from UW and Wanapum Heritage Center. And next slide, please. Lastly, my contact information is there. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you have questions, concerns, compliments, comments, please feel free to reach out to me. You can also find the Hanford History Project at hanfordhistory.com. There you'll see we have thousands of photographs online, as well as our hundreds of oral histories that we've done and collected throughout the community, including a collection of focused on African-American oral histories at Hanford and Pasco from World War II through the Civil Rights era.
Alrighty, thank you, Robert, so much. I know that Ginger and I we do a lot of Hanford history related stuff with our work, and I make a lot of social media posts about Hanford history, but I'm always amazed at how much I keep learning about it. So we're going to go ahead and kick things off with a pre-submitted question we had from somebody that wasn't able to attend, and then we'll get into some live questions. So Robert, this first question for you is, I do have a question about the site selection, as it seems almost identical to the various sites that were designated for the Japanese American relocation camps. Were there any clues about potential relocation camps as the Hanford area was chosen? The low population desert sites that used WPA labor to dig irrigation ditches in areas that were not popular for agriculture were all conveniently available for use in 1942.
Yeah, that's true. That's there. I think there's some rationale there. There's not necessarily an overt link, to my knowledge, between sites chosen for Japanese relocation and site chosen for Hanford, but there are similarities. It's far away from the coast. That's helpful. To keep it, kind of out of the ability of Japanese intelligence or Japanese, say there's some sort of invasion of the West Coast. One of the notable events that happened during World War II at Hanford was actually a Japanese balloon bomb took out a power line and momentarily caused a shutdown of one of the reactors. So the Japanese did interfere, did attack Hanford in some small way. But both the Japanese relocation and the site selection of Hanford wanted large desert areas away from the coast, devoid of people, areas that could be relatively secure. And so indeed they had that in common. I don't believe that, though there was a lot of overlap between, because the Army Corps of Engineers and the Manhattan Project also had other needs, like especially the location of the river, the Columbia River, and the fast-flowing water, and the need for surplus electricity would have been a little different from the site selection for Japanese Americans. And although the selection of Hanford certainly brought a little more scrutiny on the small Japanese American community that did live in Benton and Franklin counties, and in fact, the second exclusion zones, there's the first exclusion zone, which is along the coast. It was later modified. There's a second exclusion zone, and that line actually runs right through the Tri-Cities. Japanese American residents of Benton County were interred, most of them, whereas Franklin County was a little more up in the air. The Yamauchi family was was a very prominent Japanese American family in the Tri-Cities in Benton and Franklin County. And in that family, the daughters and the wife were allowed to stay, Chiko Yamauchi and her daughters, but the patriarch and the men and his sons were interred. And one of those sons, George Yamauchi, actually fought for the United States, was one of the SS boys, and fought for the United States in the European theater. So I hope I answered your question. Not a direct link between those two, but certainly similarities.
Awesome. Thank you for your answer, Robert. And one of our first live questions we had asked tonight was, has any land been returned to folks that lost it in 1942, tribal or Euro settlers?
No, it is not. Tribes, to my knowledge, are allowed certain types of access, generally like tribal tours that go on. I was a docent for one of those tours for a group of Nez Perce youth and Yakama youth that came. And tribes are in consultation with the DOE on cleanup activities, and are a consulting member of the National Park Service's park interpretation as they build interpretation. But no, certainly nothing that looks like what access did look like before Hanford. And even in that area after the treaties were signed, there's a loss of access there as well, right? So there's really this kind of pre-European, pre-Euro-American, full traditional, use, and then of course this period. According to a lot of the Euro-American residents that we interviewed, folks that lived in White Bluffs and Hanford, they said they had pretty genial relations with the Wanapum, especially, and that I interviewed one lady whose mother would write letters for Johnny Buck. She would or write letters in English for him, and that family let Wanapum people store some of their winter goods, seasonal goods, on their property. Sometimes I feel like you need to take those with a grain of salt because it's often people remembering events from many decades previous, kind of seeing them through a lens of more modern understanding of a different American Indian policy. But there seemed to be some level of kind of peaceful coexistence in a way. But none of the land has been returned to the Euro-American settlers, partially because they sold it. They were paid fee title for the land. It was the land ownership changed hands. The land that has been withdrawn from the Hanford site is now part of, again, that Hanford Region National Monument and the Ebner Fitzhart Arid Lands Ecology Preserve.
Actually, thank you so much for that answer, Robert. And the next question we had was, tell about the name of the town of Hanford. Where did that come from? And if you don't mind, I can actually start with that. I made a social media post about this a while ago.
Sure.
I have a clipping of this I might be able to share. But basically, Hanford, and this is what the posting reads, Hanford, a town on the Columbia River in the northeastern part of Benton County. It was named in 1906 by the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company in honor of the president of the company, Cornelius H. Hanford of Seattle, who was one of the founders of the big reclamation project, who was also the first and most prominent federal judge in the state of Washington. And Robert, do you want to say anything else on that?
No, just that he ended up becoming mired by scandal, and had to step down. And that Hanford project was largely, like most irrigation projects, a giant financial boondoggle. The town had been platted for about 5,000. Actually, the Manly Bostwick Haynes, kind of the guy that got the project together, who was the son-in-law of Cornelius Hanford, had initially platted the town thinking it would soon someday rival Chicago, so he platted it for 5,000 people. Briefly, it was a town of 45,000 people. So it kind of and it certainly achieved immortality, or its sort of level of infamousness. Probably not what he planned, but certainly become a name that we all know, unlike most towns of the arid West. But yeah, that is you were right on there, Ryan. You got the basics there.
Awesome. And I did share my screen with the screenshot. Not sure if you guys will be able to see it or not. I can share it in the link later too. But basically, it's just a newspaper clipping that one of our staff found. So let me go ahead and stop sharing that.
If people click on your image, it I don't know, it worked for some reason.
Gotcha.
So let's see, what's our next question? How about one that was sent to us ahead of time was, what were the other sites considered before Hanford was chosen?
We don't have a ton of information about that. We do know that Franklin Matthias, the Army Corps engineer who would be directly under Groves, surveyed sites, many most in California, I believe one in Oregon, and then Hanford is actually the last site. And he was not very happy with most of the other sites he had surveyed. Either the river didn't quite cut it, or there were too many people nearby, or it was too remote. Because this is kind of the dynamic he's working with, or the catch-22 is they wanted someplace remote, but you need to bring around 50,000 people there and a whole bunch of material and supplies to build these massive facilities, and you need to build a town of like 12,000 people near it who are going to run the thing. So Pasco being we're just down the river, like down the street, connected by rail and by road, was a huge boon. But the other sites, none were nearly as fit the bill as Hanford. In fact, in his diary, he wrote something to the effect of, "At last, now I found it." It was his big discovery. Very, he's in this plane, he's kind of cruising over it, and in that moment, life would change for everybody down there.
And he could go home for Christmas without getting fired.
And for the rest of us, yes, yeah, that was what interesting. I just want to mention real quick. So Matthias keeps this diary, and one of the most interesting things about this diary is that Groves orders Matthias to keep a diary. No one on the Manhattan Project is really supposed to be keeping very many records, only those high up. And Matthias normally shouldn't have kept a diary, but Groves told him to keep a diary. And then he had to send the diary in sections to Groves to edit. And so Matthias is writing this diary, sends it off to Groves. Groves does his edits word. And why? Well, Groves was worried that they were going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars at Hanford. And what if it doesn't work? Well, if it doesn't work, they and DuPont, which if you, DuPont had been dragged before the government in the 1930s it as part of investigation for profits made during World War I. They had been labeled the merchants of death, which was a huge reason why they didn't want to take the Hanford project. But they were convinced by Groves. But Groves orders Matthias to keep this diary because it's a CYA, right? It's a cover your blank, that they'll have a record, an authoritative personal record of what they did. So if they get dragged before a Senate subcommittee after the war, and some senator is trying to make a name for himself as saying, you spent hundreds of millions of dollars for nothing, they can say, well, here's what we thought, here's what we wanted to do. And so Matthias and Groves have this very tense relationship where Matthias is supposedly, so if you ever do read Matthias's diary, it is not a diary. It is this purposely, carefully created and edited document that functions as a really unobjective internal history of the project.
Cool.
Excellent background. We have another question that's kind of related to this, the tribal settlements and the towns that lived here before. And it's just asking, can you tell us more about the residents that were kicked off their properties? I'm not sure if you have any other information you think might be useful to share or relevant to share that you think might be interesting.
Sure. If I could do a plug here, this is actually the subject of the first book in the Hanford History series called Nowhere to Remember, Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland to 1943. Published through WSU Press. For as part of that book series, we interviewed 27 former residents of the towns of Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland. And those interviews are also available in long form up on our website, hanfordhistory.com. But the short of it is that Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland were struggling agricultural communities. They were those where most people that lived there were subsistence level farming. They were kind of just pulling themselves out of the Great Depression when the government condemned their land. And they were largely, kind of proud, salt of the earth farming folk, as far as the Euro-American settlers that live there. Tribes, tribal members, of course, access the land. Mostly seasonally was the access. There were no, at least by 1942, there were no permanently habitated Indian settlements, native indigenous settlements in the Hanford area, but lots and lots and lots of seasonal use, fishing. In fact, a lot of the people we interviewed remember seeing the massive drying racks for salmon that would appear in the late spring and the summer. And there was a lot of trading that went on, a lot of trading for between agricultural crops for salmon and other things like that. And the Wanapum kind of, their homes, one of their seasonal habitations was just north of the Hanford site. And so this, the areas were really a backwater. They were small rural agriculture areas, and had Matthias not flown over and said, that's it, they would have probably befallen the fate that most other small agricultural towns. You can get an atlas or Google Maps of Eastern Washington and find hundreds of little places with desiccated downtowns with vacant brick storefronts that you've never heard of and are really hard to get to because they're not serviced by a interstate highway. And that probably would have been, Richland may have grown to be a bit more because it was always orientated towards Kennewick and Pasco. But Hanford and White Bluffs were actually connected by rail, not to Pasco, but they were connected to Beverly up north. So they were much more orientated towards Yakama. Whereas in this split found its way into the post the post-Manhattan Project memory of these, what we call the pre-43 residents, where the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association forms in 1944, and they start meeting in Prosser to kind of commiserate and commemorate. And the Richland people form what's called the Old Timers Picnic. And those two groups are like oil and water. They did not mix. Like, Richland people didn't really mix with Hanford White Bluffs people. And they even after the shared kind of traumatic experience of the sudden demise of their community, they still kept that regional identity into the future. And a lot of the material for our first book, and then a lot our pre-Manhattan collections, is called the Harry Anderson Collection, and it's up on our website. Harry Anderson was one of the people that formed the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association, and we have their records. And it's really, they did a lot of good work of trying to keep the history of those communities alive. But it was really amazing to see how there's almost nothing about Richland in there. And you'd think that shared trauma would have kind of brought them together, but no, it didn't, not at all. And I think because the Hanford White Bluffs people felt that where they lived was totally taken, whereas Richland just underwent this very strange metamorphosis into this perfect nuclear family utopian community. But, elements of the old Richland still exist, right? For example, the White Bluffs Hanford people, their cemeteries got dug up and moved. Of course, this was not, indigenous remains were not identified, dug up, and removed. And many of those are, of course, thousands of years of habitation mean that many of those still litter the banks of the Columbia. Or not litter, sorry. Many of those are on the banks of the Columbia. Whereas for the Euro-Americans, their burials, their cemeteries were moved to Prosser. Whereas the Richland Cemetery was incorporated into the town, and there's still something like 15 pre-Manhattan Project buildings left in Richland, mostly houses. And so that also, but certainly for those, if you had lived in pre-Manhattan Project Richland, you would not recognize the Richland. Mm-hmm. It was full of these people, weird people who were from everywhere else but Richland. And that's one of the really interesting things about Richland in the 40s and 50s, is that, this would have been a town of no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Like, everybody moved there to work at Hanford, and it was this kind of totally, this town without it, that purposely erased whatever history had been there before. The farming history, the indigenous history, just erased, and a new, history overlaid. This Hanford history, this nuclear age overlaid on top of that. And that really has complicated things for indigenous peoples and those old residents of the farming towns to really reclaim their history and that connection to the land.
Thank you so much for diving more into that. I think that's really insightful. Another question we had, and I think this one might apply to all three of us that we can answer: are there still 177 tanks today?
Indeed, there are. 149 of them are single shell tanks, which means there's only one container with a steel container with a concrete outer shell, and 28 that are double shelled. So they have a interior container and what's called an annulus. It's about 2.5 feet wide, and then an outer shell. And we are working to, we are regulating the Department of Energy, who is working to retrieve the waste from those tanks and either treat it at the waste treatment plant, or they're talking about doing on-site, in situ, tank-side cesium removal, and then that will create a different waste issue. And they will probably be closed in place and never removed, because they're huge. They're about the size of an elementary school gymnasium, and they would be far too dangerous to dig up, and then you'd just be making a bigger mess somewhere else.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ginger. And I know there's another question that you were going to take. Do you want to go ahead and ask that one?
Oh, yeah. I think Laura Feldman asked about whether land is being parted out and sold off. And no, the Hanford site, well, that's not true. The Department of Energy has released a bit of land in the North Richland, what they call the Horn Rapids Triangle, but it's not to private individual ownership so much as to corporations for light industrial and science research kind of activities. The Pacific Northwest National Lab built a new laboratory north of their original campus. And I don't see much likelihood of any private ownership ever happening. Right now, the plan is that most of the site will remain attached to the monument and the Hanford Reach National Monument or the Manhattan Project National Park. And then there's going to be, I think it's about a 10 square mile central area that will have remaining facilities that will still be being cleaned up for long into the future, and or may be able to be used for some other new industrial purposes that limit the amount of time people are out there.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ginger. Another question we had asked in the live chat was any info about the trains that ran between the Hanford site and the uranium mine to the north, or about the naming of those railroad junctions, such as Pearl, Aubrey, Emma, etc.
So the uranium that went and powered the Manhattan Project specifically, most of that uranium actually came from the Belgian Congo, and that's another really interesting tie of the Manhattan Project and Hanford to race, and to the exploitative extraction of uranium in the Belgian Congo. The naming of the junctions so there were some junctions named and whistle stops in that, especially in that 1938 Metzger map that I had on my second slide. A couple of things like Julietta and Vernita, a couple of names that are still around today. But the Pearl and the Edna, those were the story I've heard, at least, is those junctions were put there by when they built the internal railroad. So that's a Manhattan Project era railroad, and that was done. They were names either of secretaries in the office that did that, or the names of some of the engineers' wives. Clearly, that follows right a long tradition of naming things based off of men naming things based off of important women, whether mothers or secretaries or wives or things like that. So that's the story I've heard, and it seems to kind of fit the convention of the time, shall we say.
Awesome, thank you for answering that one as well. And I put this in the chat, but if anybody has any other questions, feel free to keep asking them. We're here to answer any questions you have about early Hanford history. And Ginger, do you want to ask one of our other pre-submitted questions?
I actually have a different question that somebody messaged me. Does anybody have any today's value estimates on how much the Hanford cost from the startup until the end of the war?
Yeah, so actually, I've done the math. Hanford, so the Manhattan Project roughly is about $2 billion. And that was the total cost of three facilities. Hanford makes up around $240 million of that. So that's the construction and operation budget up until when DuPont wrote their official history of the project shortly when they were leaving, when before the transition to AEC, and then the new General Electric is the new contractor, and we'll talk about that in part 2. So about 240 million, 220, 240 roughly, and that is the total cost it takes to build Hanford, and of course that of course though pales in comparison to the annual cleanup budget.
Exactly. All right.
Well, I know another pre-submitted question we had was, is it true that plutonium was shipped from Hanford to Los Alamos in an ambulance?
It was initially driven. One of the ways it did get down there was it was driven. Another way was that it was put in a briefcase, a very heavy briefcase that was shackled to an Army Corpsman, and told to he was told to not let it out of its sight. But I believe it was driven to the train station in an ambulance. And the Department of Energy, or early on it's Manhattan Project, and then it becomes the AEC, and then it's IRTA, and then DOE. But throughout the history of plutonium production Hanford site, a lot of different methods of subterfuge and protection were used to secure plutonium shipments. I've interviewed guys that worked in that final stage process, and they would talk about the almost special forces like people that would come to pick up the plutonium shipment. I mean, we're talking like the serious armed guard, heavy weapons, all in black, unmarked cars. This was taken pretty seriously. Earlier on, it was a little more seat of your pants in terms of the delivery. But remember, I mean, the absolute secrecy was needed because they're delivering a product that cost $240 million to produce. And we're just in small kilogram quantities, right? Early on, it's not that much. Later on, the process becomes more refined. Early on, the waste stream was intense. They were producing so much waste and losing a lot of plutonium, and they refined the process over the years. But yeah, there's a little bit of truth to that ambulance story. But the road, you couldn't have driven it down to Los Alamos in time. It was trucked out in an ambulance to a train. It was deemed to be not safe enough to drive all the way down there.
Yeah, I can't imagine the driving. In one of the oral histories, it's from a gal, and I don't remember which one, and she talks about going to Portland for the weekend. And I'm just thinking, what was the drive to Portland like back then from the weekend? Or for the weekend, and what were the roads like that you could actually make a weekend trip?
That's a solid 8-hour.
It had to have been. Yeah. I bet a lot of it was not. Most of it was probably not paved, right? I mean, it's kind of a crazy thought. So we have one more question, and I think we're probably. Or how long do we want this event to be? We were thinking about an hour. We don't want to cut it off, but at the same time, we don't want to take too much of people's evenings.
Yeah. I mean, we definitely want to ask or answer all the questions that we can. And we did get another one. So do you want to take that one, Ginger?
Yeah, sure. The question is, any info about the scientists who participated in the Hanford project who then spoke out in alarm about the danger, those who changed their minds?
To my knowledge, it was more of the physicists of Los Alamos that seemed to, at the time, but especially after the dropping of the bomb, kind of wrestle with the continued production of plutonium and atomic weapons. Most physicists, in fact, almost all, with a couple notable exceptions, but even those at Los Alamos, certainly believed that the early bomb, that they believed in building the early bombs for most of a degree, but the continued military control was very alarming to many of them, and they really pushed for internationalization, democratization of this knowledge, and the U.S. of course resisted that heavily and wanted to keep that knowledge secure. I mean, we didn't even share it with our allies, the British, right? We didn't, it took us years to assist them with their atomic program. As far as Hanford, Hanford is really much more of an industrial workhouse. There's for the scientists that are here, most of them were industrial chemists, and doing hydro engineering, as well as graphite engineers. It was more of an engineering story at Hanford than it is kind of a hard science story. And to the folks that I've talked to and the research I've done, most of those people were pretty comfortable with the work they were doing. They were told by their government that the work they did at World War II and continue to do was beneficial for defense. They certainly got paid well, and I think that that bargain, that kind of privileged position was good enough for them, much like it was for their Russian counterparts at Mayak and it's in our kind of the sister cities in the Soviet Union.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you. And I thought before we close out, because I'm not seeing any more questions, but I thought I'd just ask all of us, Robert, Ginger, what is one maybe fact or part of Hanford history that you find really fascinating and that's maybe not that well commonly known, or that's more of a a really fun trivia thing that's one of your favorite parts. But I thought we could just end and share one of our favorite parts of history.
Okay.
If
Shall
you
I
guys
go
want to
first?
think about it for a second, I can take one too if you want to think about that for a second.
Oh, no, I have one. I
Okay,
think
go
one of
ahead.
the things that's the most interesting to me is that, um, you know, according to the header of Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction, most of those stack releases, the releases from the 200 area during the processing, the vast majority of those actually occurred during World War II, during 1944 and 1945. The filtration systems, the green run being, of course, an exception that we'll talk about in the next presentation, but the vast majority of the releases were done before they figure out the filtration technology. And I think that often when we think about the contamination that came in terms of atmospheric releases, the narrative is really centered on the Cold War, and I think we need to decouple and recenter that on World War II as well. And I think we often are hesitant to engage in criticism of World War II because it's kind of known as the good war in American history. This kind of this purposeful war that America fights against, clear evil. And while we certainly were fighting, horribly corrupt and bad regimes, the Nazis and the militaristic Japanese regime, nevertheless, the story of waste at Hanford is more complicated. And so I think that, understanding that, bad things can be done in a good war. But also though that was an evolving situation, and one where this was a brand new industry and there were not the kinds of safeguards in a brand new industry as they later developed in the Cold War. And so I think decoupling the good war narrative is really important for us as we look to the past and really engage in constructive discussions about the history of Hanford.
Fascinating. Ginger, what you got?
I found listening to Leona Libby's oral history, and she was the only female on the B reactor crew, and her story, like many other stories of smart scientists, and they weren't necessarily, she was a chemist, but there were a lot of women, just like that movie Hidden Figures for the space program. There were a lot of women, including Black women, doing mathematics and other research and engineering and things behind the scenes. And it's really interesting. Libby went on to teach at UCLA, and when she died, there was absolutely no mention of her role in the Manhattan Project in her obituary. And I think it's important that we make sure that we tell everybody's stories, and including the people who were pushed off the land and the tribes. But there were, it's really, regardless of what happened, there's just so much rich history that has come out of this. And I'm not a huge history buff, but there's some really interesting stuff out there for people that can pique just about anybody's interest, I think.
I agree, and I think that those that are watching can kind of get the picture that we could actually talk about this topic for hours if we really wanted to. So we're not gonna bore you all for hours and hours upon this stuff, but you'll probably find if you follow our Hanford social media for ecology that I share a lot of fun facts and trivia from history. And one of my favorite ones I shared a couple times was it involves the first bank of White Bluffs, and there are two currently still standing buildings from the original Hanford and White Bluffs towns, and that's the old Hanford High School and the first bank of White Bluffs. And this one fact I found kind of interesting was that the old first bank of White Bluffs was once robbed before work started on the Hanford site. And so per legend, the robber buried the money someplace between White Bluffs and Moses Lake. And Moses Lake, however, the robber was shot and killed before he could either retrieve his haul or tell others of its location, and the money has yet to be found. So I find
treasure, hidden treasure.
Could I have one more lighthearted quick one?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna riff off yours, Ginger. So if you go visit the B reactor, which once we open back up for tours, I sincerely hope that those of you that haven't can come out to the national park.
Yeah,
if one of the side rooms in the reactor has a first aid kit and it's filled with Kotex tampons, and a lot of the question, when I'm giving the tour, I always like to point this out, and I like to ask people, what do you think these were for? Knowing that there's only one woman that worked in the reactor for a very brief period of time. And after the Eleanor Woods Libby left, there were no women workers in the reactor for decades. And people kind of, wander around. And one of the short answer is that Kotex pads were found to be very absorbent. And when you're cleaning up spills that have contamination, and you want something that has high levels of absorbency. And if you ask people that have worked in as health physics technicians or in nuclear reactors long enough, any old timer Hanford, they'll tell you that, yeah, they use feminine hygiene pads as part of radiation protection work. And I like to imagine what the guys unloading this first shipment of boxes of Kotex at the reactor, what in the world they were thinking they were building out in the reactor that needed, where there's no women around, but boxes of Kotex. So that's one of my favorite. That's my favorite artifact in the B reactor, actually.
Yeah, I'm reading the Apocalypse Factory, and that I just learned that too. We always just thought they were really generous and had no idea how fast we went through them when we actually were.
No, any HPT, any old school HPT can verify that. Yeah, Kotex, it's absorbent.
That's hilarious.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and remind folks we had some really good conversation in our chat today, and there were some resources shared that you can find for some more information, along with what Robert shared, and we have a screen up here that we're sharing, if you have any other questions. But I'll go ahead and leave it to Ginger to close this out.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. And again, if you have any questions about future topics or follow-up stuff that Robert might be able to answer in his part 2, which will be a couple months from now, please send them to us at hanford@ecy.wa.gov. And this event is going to be recorded, so it will be here if you want to come back and share it with your friends. We are hoping to reach a lot more people. Historically, before COVID, I would go to Rotary clubs and schools and support STEM fairs, and Ryan and my other colleagues did as well. And we're still not able to do that. So this is our new outreach thing, and we appreciate you sharing it with your friends and families and coworkers. And Robert, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you all for coming. I also used to hit up the Rotary circuit and all of those other things, and it's just been a pleasure. I just want to thank you guys at Ecology for having me in our collaboration. It's been really great to present.
And again, we'll thank you again, Robert. It's been really fun working with you, and it's really great to partner with you and get this deep dive into early Hanford history. And we really look forward to doing our part 2 here in a couple months with you.
Yeah, come back for part 2, folks. I got some great photos, some fun analysis of the Atomic West.
Great, and I think we are working on a Hanford Groundwater 101 kind of thing for our next episode. And thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Bye.